Let's say you have your Hebrew Bible in front of you, you open Exodus 20, what do you see? You see a text looking like that, lots of things inside. You can clearly see that this one has no dots. No dots.
Welcome to episode number 9 of the Bible in OBRY. I am John, your host. Sure, let's go with that, your host. It makes it seem like a game show, and it's not. In fact, this episode, it's going to concentrate on the next document that I made in a series just examining our perceptions of color as they are related to us, translated to us in the Bible. Now, I've had the document portion of this done for weeks, and I haven't been able to record successfully an episode based on that. It's not for lack of trying. I've actually attempted to record this many times now. I lost track of how many times I attempted to record this and just realized it wasn't working. It wasn't the right one. Something was lacking. Something was wrong. And, if you pray for something to go the way it is supposed to go, as according to Yahweh's will, and then you find that it's just not working out over and over and over, then I would think, rationally, you would think, well, maybe that's because that wasn't the right material. It just wasn't meant to be. So anyways, I really thought this out a lot after I finished the document because, I could go over the documents and they're a basic template. They take what words have been translated in a certain way in King James, which is fair enough for the English-speaking world, since King James really is the standard. Whether or not it's accepted by many in today's world, in Christendom, as the standard or not, the thing is, if you just look at the patterns of translation, you'll see it's very clearly the standard. Not necessarily the standard in the sense of fathering many other translations per se, since it was actually fathered by translations preceding it. But it is definitely in that line of a similar mode of thinking. All of the translations that I have, and let's see. From the King James, which is what I usually read from and work from when I'm writing, simply because of its encoding to Strong's. Now, yes, there are other concordances, but a lot of them out there are either just variances. They just vary from Strong's, but still remain in origin to that family of English translations that the King James is within, or they were specifically created for a particular language version. So anyways, the basic text that I work from, KJV in English, and then there is as far as Masoretic Hebrew goes, there's really just basically a standard. Now, you'll have texts out there that are just called the Masoretic, and they may follow the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia to the letter, or they may not. You see, there's a few versions of Hebrew manuscripts extant, even at the time that King James translated their Bible. One of them is actually called the Second Rabbinic Bible, and it's argued whether or not it was the source for translating the Old Testament portion of the King James Bible. In fact, it's called Mikreot Gedalot, or the Second Rabbinic Bible of 1525. That I don't think is available in an eSword module. You can get it. It's in 4 parts. You can get it at archive.org. Same thing with the Complutensian Polyglot. I have to work from just an actual PDF when I want to look at that as well. In eSword itself, so I've got 2 different Hebrew Old Testament versions. One may be closer to the BHS, which is based on the Leningrad Codex. There are portions of these Masoretic texts that are used to put together these modules and digital Bibles and even printed Hebrew Bibles that could be from Leningrad. They could be the what is it? The other codex. It's incomplete. Unfortunately, it's the name of it's slipping my mind. Yes, Aleppo. I actually had to look it up. It was gone. So there are a few other codices, but very few are intact, other than the Leningrad Codex and the, as I just said, it's the Second Hebrew Bible, or the Second Rabbinic Bible, they call it, 1525 Mikreot Gedalot. Those manuscripts, or let's say modules, that are put together for programs like eSword or the Logos and others, or that are just printed. There's so many of them. The same sort of thing is done with them that are done with most of the English Bibles, where they might get scholars together who simply decide what portions to pull from what manuscripts to make whatever translation they're making. A lot of that has to do with copyright limitations. So then I also have the Septuagint and the Latin Vulgate, and the Apostolic Bible Polyglot, in addition to Brenton's, which is the Breton English translation of the Septuagint, the Bishop's Bible, the Geneva Bible. I don't keep a lot of modern translations around, just because when doing studies, really all I need is one English version, and then maybe others to compare. Brenton's is a good comparison because of how much the Septuagint varies at times. And the Latin, what's surprising about Latin is how many, this is strange too, is that the sort of bridge that Latin is, in my estimation, between OBRY and English. There are so many words and concepts that I'm familiar with through the study of OBRY that I see expressed in Latin. And then because of the patchwork nature of the English language, there are so many words and roots that I see in Latin that I really don't need to go into any kind of translation program in order to understand. But anyways, that rabbit trail aside, one of the things that kept me from just sitting down and doing this, getting it done and moving on, because I really do want to complete the next, it's probably going to be around 4 episodes probably after this, would complete a season of this. And I do want to stay the course in the sense of just examining a whole family of a concept, and that being colors, our modern perception of colors, and what the authors of the Bible, inspired by Yahweh, use as colors. Because I don't think there's a complete equivalence between the two. And we saw that with white. The very first color presentation I did and word study on the color white. Now, what I left out of that, I'm hoping to bring more strongly into this. And it is the fact that, first off, with white and with black, or with any grays, and gray is going to be probably included in a word study that includes a number of colors, because there are actually a number of colors that just, they appear so seldomly and randomly, they don't need a full episode. But the big ones that really did, in my estimation, were white, black, and red. There's reasons for this. With the white and the red, those are 2 words that are used very commonly to describe our exterior appearance, and they're very apropos. Now, with the white document, the one thing I didn't stress during the episode on white that maybe I should have, and here's my redemption. Even though only about 1 term in all of that, Laban, I accounted as a passing, as far as it having at least a degree of equivalence to our modern concept of white, at least as a pigment, because I'm going to talk a little bit about that difference between the pigment aspect of it and the shade aspect of it, or tint. I'll get into that. The funny thing was, there were actually a few other terms that may not have passed as an equivalent of white. But the thing is, depending on their degree used, or the degree in which is to be perceived, if it was a word that was appropriately translated as dazzling or bright or something of that nature, it could be seen, if nothing else, in the family of white to different degrees. And I did put a note at the top of that document too, that there is a relationship because of the 2 possibilities of white and also black, that there should be at least considered a relationship between light and words meaning things that are light or bright or dazzling, which a lot of those words are used in descriptions of various individuals of our people. So they are appropriate. But here's where there's the duality of classification of both white and black. So even though you can find both white and black in pigment form in nature, in natural things, they're not only And in that respect, white and black are both technically correct, being expressed as a color. However, white and black are also representations of either the extreme of light or the extreme of dark. In fact, if you're in the business of colors, mixing colors, design, art, you're going to know that you have hues. And now today, our hues are basically defined as the three primaries, secondaries, and infinite tertiaries of those primaries. That's a hue. Anything that can be considered a pure mix of those, basically those three primary colors. And that is actually a lot of different colors that can be produced from those primaries. Those are hues. Now, when you start mixing any amount of white, and now this is just technically if we're color mixing, if we're in the business of mixing colors. Okay, if you mix any degree of white with those pure hues, you're going to get a tint. It's called a tint. And all it does essentially is it lightens the color. It doesn't brighten the color. It doesn't work in that way. Like if you took something that was just some natural hue and you put it in sunlight, it may seem far brighter, of course, than if it was in the shade. Well, it doesn't work that way when you mix white in as a pigment itself. It's a little bit different than mixing light and dark. And so that's where you have this sort of dual nature in the perception of white and black. And now if you mix gray into a natural hue, you're going to get what's called a tone. And these are typically the most pleasing to people's eyes, are tones. Then if you mix any degree of black as a pigment into any of those natural hues, you're going to get what is considered a shade. And shades are like those nice, dark, rich colors. They're the ones that I really like. Even with colors that I'm not a super fan of, when in a shade or even a tone, I find them far more pleasing. So, all right, that's as far as tints go. But here's the thing. As I said, it also is a matter of light and darkness. If you have anything that's colored in any way, the world around you is full of natural hues. If you were to saturate them to the point of pure light, you wouldn't even be able to tell what color they are, because there is nothing but pure, unadulterated light. You would have problems distinguishing anything, because the light would literally saturate everything to the point where you could not even distinguish. Conversely, the same works with dark. If you took away all light, you would have black. You would have darkness, pitch black. So again, you could not distinguish anything, any color. Artists know this. They're taught this when they're taught to replicate things that they observe naturally. They're taught that both light and darkness have an effect on colors and shapes. You really can't have even perception of depth without the proper translation of lightness and darkness. And that leads me to the point that was one of the biggest snags that I encountered after making this document. Okay, so dualism. The philosophy of dualism and what's become religious spiritual expression, dualism. This idea that, this idea about light and darkness, that, as I said, I mean, just in the natural world, in order to distinguish anything, you have to have a certain amount of both light and darkness. If it's daytime, the things that you see and experience in the daytime, in the light and the warmth, are going to be, to you, perceptionally at least, very different than those same things that you experience in the night, in the dark, in the cold. Just because, and here's kind of one of the problems for me, is just because that exists, there is that dual function of light and darkness, and you need both to just experience the creation at all. In fact, separating the light from the darkness was the first thing that Yahweh did. He created light, Our, and then he separated Our from Hashak, darkness. And he named Our Yom, day, and he named Hashak, darkness, Lila, night. This is the first thing he really did. This is verse 3 of Genesis chapter 1. So there is a sense of real, practical, tangible elements, although light's not really tangible, not that you can touch it per se. But there are real phenomena that come with light and darkness. And there is a certain degree of real duality that exists in the fact that you need both, not only to perceive color, but to perceive depth through highlight and shadow. And I'm sure so much more that I'm even forgetting. However, even though that is the case, it seems like that natural phenomenon has been perhaps erroneously carried over into a duality of a spiritual nature in the sense of the God and Satan idea. And now with pagan religions, it gets to the extreme that, let's say, both a god of light and darkness, let's say a Zeus and Hades, both have a certain great amount of power. Of course, in Greek mythology, Zeus would always sort of win out over Hades, but there are a number of pagan belief systems, and when I say pagan, I'm just referring to anything that is not biblically orthodox. So that's just basically it. There comes with it this sense of duality, spiritual duality. Now that doesn't work, though, if you pay close attention to the Bible, because Yahweh specifically says that it is He that creates and brings both good things and evil things. He does not put all of that on the back of this character, Satan or the devil. I mean, in fact, if you want to know who creates most of the evil that we've ever experienced or know of, it's man. In the sense that, and this is going to get into a whole realm of defining words like thub being good, ro being evil, and in what other ways those words are used as. I don't want to go too far down that road. However, I do want to point out that I think that it is just wise to understand that there is a difference between pointing out the logical, observable duality in the natural world created by light and darkness, and there is a large degree of that phenomena created by light and darkness that is used in Scripture to define things that are good or righteous and things that are wicked, evil, which you could be really basic in your understanding about it. Look at anything wicked and evil is anything that deviates from the natural order created and put in motion by Yahweh, and anything that he commands to be done, which is deviated from or not done. That is evil. That is darkness. Light is anything that runs in harmony with the way he created everything to run and to go. You see things that he calls abominations, and they are things that run in stark contrast to the natural way he made things, or the natural way that he made us to be. Sodomy, homosexuality, that runs contrary to the natural way he made everything to work. Different species and different kinds intermingling, which we don't really see in nature. It usually takes a man with a perverted heart to mix those things together. That sort of mixing is contrary. He says don't mix certain seeds. Don't mix any seeds together. They're different kinds. Don't mix different fabrics together. They're different kinds. It goes against nature. And I'm sorry that we've gotten so far from our understanding of what is natural and good that we don't really understand when we are perverting the natural way and order of things. But to bring it back around, there's a large amount of euphemism, metaphor, allegory to be found in the usage of light and dark, and the extreme of light is going to be very much like the equivalent of the pigment white, as well as the extreme of dark, very similar to the pigment black. And that's why those two things are a bit more complicated than any of the studies that would be done on things that could be considered just a pure hue. And those two things, light and dark or white and black, depending on how you want to look at them, they have a marked effect on all hues. And as I mentioned, when I did an introduction to colors, even the hues, depending on what hue it is going to carry with it both biblically and in other religions and philosophies, we just tend to have certain ideas that seem to come along with colors. Some of it is cultural. Some cultures regard certain colors in certain ways that others don't. But the thing is, it seems inexplicable. You can't really have colors without, even if not the culture, the individual applying some sort of transcendent quality to a color, something deeper about it other than it just being a pure hue. So having said that, let's just get straight into the document, and hopefully I can illustrate the way in which this works. And moreover, because this is really the point, more than anything else, is to, of course, try to understand the mind inherent in the language, because it is not the mind inherent in our modern languages, or specifically English. And that is what we're trying to understand. We need to understand the different mind that is present within the languages that are used in the Bible. If we're going to understand what's being said and what's being translated to us, if we're going to understand the quote-unquote God of the Bible and his nature and character, we're going to have to understand the language, why he chose to use and preserve this language. Because if not, I can't imagine how much we're missing out using a language that, in my opinion, is far the inferior of what pure OBRY is going to, in time, prove to be. So there are words that are variously translated as black, blackness, blackened. The first one we're going to look at is one of the weirdest. It is Strong's number H380, and the word is Isoon. Keeping in mind, I pronounce everything in OBRY, not Hebrew. Hebrew, the Masoretic that added all of the vowel points or punctuation over the pure language. They just decide at one time that an ah is going to be pronounced ah or e, and at another time that it'll be pronounced or e or o or I. It's completely arbitrary, so I do not use their pronunciation. I use a pronunciation that is based on an overview of how pronunciation has been utilized in all of the similar languages that have a composition using the basic 5 vowel sounds. Okay, so this is a, I, sha, u, n, Isoon. Now, when I first looked at this, what struck me as so odd is its composition. First off, its root. Its root is the word aish. Aish is most commonly translated as, and as far as I'm concerned, contextually, pretty correctly, as man, even though it should probably be, since man at least alludes to something correct, it should probably be translated as male, as in gender. There's a few different words that are translated as man, and they really ought to be parsed out correctly. Adam is more of a description of kind. Adam, it's more of a description of kind. Aish, description of male. Specifically, a lot of women, when speaking in the Bible, are going to call their husband Aish, their male, their man, their husband. Where if a man speaking of a woman who's his wife is going to refer to her as Asha, the feminine aspect of that word. Another word that's used, and it's probably incorrectly translated as man, though I'm pretty sure it's mostly just translated as male, is anash or anush. And as far as I'm concerned, based on the structure that I've witnessed in OBRY, it is just a variation of Aish. The I and N are swapped out with such a regularity that I have to perceive that as really just a variation of Aish. And then there is Zakar. Zakar first appears in Genesis 1 in the creation of Adam, when Aliyim says he's going to make them Zakar and Nakbe. And then it's used again later on when speaking of specifically male lives and female lives, Zakar, Nakbe. Zakar also is translated as to remember. And that's a whole interesting thing right there. So when seeing this, Aish, a word that specifically means the male of the, I don't think it's just the species of Adam, but I actually haven't done a close enough word study into it to see if it was just specifically about Adam. You see, there are some terms that are more general than others, but it is definitely a term that is denoting something masculine, Aish, as opposed to Asha. Then the other thing that struck me was the suffix on it, un. Whenever you see this suffix, un, in OBRY or Hebrew, it's going to be used kind of like our suffixes today, ous, or when we use the suffix y or ie. And it means that this word is descriptive. And it's trying to tell you that this descriptive thing with the un is like the root, but is not the root. I'll give you an example. The great strong man of Judges 14, 15, 16 that everybody knows as Samson. His actual name in OBRY is Shimashun. It is the root shamash with the suffix un. Shamash is the word for son. So a literal mechanical translation in a way, and I know some people might find this is a little odd, but it's true. If I were to give you the best sounding translation today of his name, I would say his name would have been Sonny. And I'm not kidding. Sonny. So that's the way that un suffix is used. So here we have this Isoon. So that suffix is meaning like male. And what threw me at first was I couldn't figure out what the one had to do with the other, and I'll tell you why. Because first off, the definition given of it is the pupil of the eye, and the second definition is the middle of the night. And they say that is the deepest blackness. However, I think they're really mixing apples with oranges here. I even saw one definition that called it the little man. Yeah, it's in the Gesenius Hebrew Chaldee lexicon. He says, the little man of the eye. Now, at first, that seemed really goofy to me until I understood how it should be looked at. It's only 5 times it appears. The first 3 times are actually in relation to the eye. Deuteronomy 32:10, he instructed him, he kept him, as the apple of his eye, and it's Isoon. The Isoon of the Oin. Oin is the word used for eye. Psalm 17:8, keep me as the apple Isoon of the Oin eye. Proverbs 7:2, and my law as the apple of thine eye. Now the last two, Proverbs 7:9, is in the twilight, in the evening, in the black and dark of night. And Proverbs 20:20, whoso curseth his father and his mother, his lamp shall be put out in obscure darkness. Now, those two translations don't really reflect the wording that's going on in Proverbs 7:9 and Proverbs 20:20. The thing about them is the wording directly implies, as funny enough, the definition told us, the center or middle or heart of a thing. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the middle of the eye is black, the pupil. The center or middle of the night is the darkest hour. And the center or heart of darkness is the blackest part. Just like the center or middle of lightness is going to be the lightest part. If you lit a match in a dark room, you would see that the center or middle of it is the brightest part, of course. However, that doesn't mean that the word itself should be considered as black or dark. The word itself, given the fact that its root is aish or male, not Adam, having to do with Adam, which is more special or kind, but male. One thing I think that helps is if we understand how, for instance, the occult expresses their duality. The occult is always about expressing duality. They're very much into duality, dual nature. The occult pushes the idea of God and Satan in a dual aspect. The Masons have their black and white checkered floors, and many people of an occult mind have built a number of monuments accentuating both the male and female aspects to their dualism philosophy. So we can see that in the Vatican St. Peter's Square, with the obelisk being the male aspect, and the large circle, which is always put around the obelisk. It always has that large circular female aspect around it. When you understand that, then you can understand how Isoon is used. The male aspect carrying with it at least the connotation of being center, middle, or piercing. So it is not a surprise that the word for male is used in this word, which unfortunately is translated as black, when it actually would be far more appropriate if it was translated as middle in some sort of masculine sense. Then you would get an understanding of it. So it is unfortunate that it is expressed in that way. However, it is a fail when it comes to being some sort of equivalent of our black. Now, the next one is the only one that actually got a pure pass out of all of them. And you're going to see why. There's a very good reason, unfortunately. It's not within the listing itself. The next one is Strong's H2821, Hashak. Now, what they list, when they list Hashak, and this is part of the joy of Strong's and other concordances, dictionaries, and lexicons parsing out these words. They parse out these words because the Masoretes, through their punctuation, dots and dashes, or nikud, nikudot, as they're called, the Masorah is one of the easiest ways to say it. They're Masorah. They separate so many words into a noun aspect of it, or a verb aspect of it, or an adjective, and so on and so forth. So this is actually the verb aspect of it, the H2821, where you get a good idea of why it's so appropriate as black. Even though H2821, I'm going to punch into eSword, the KJC tab in the dictionary section of eSword, which I recommend everybody using frequently for word studies. You'll find that if you do that with any word, you can really easily toggle back and forth between the entries and get an idea of how any given word was parsed out, or what might be the other definitions applied to that word, whether they be right or not. If you go to the entry just before 2821 to 2820, it's the same word, but it is often translated as back, spare, like held back, spared, withheld, reserved. It's translated in 20 or more different ways, even translated as punished, refrain, hindered. Okay, if you go forward one, you'll see that it is again the same word, Hashak. Now, instead of being an action or verb, it is a thing or noun. And the first time you see it as an actual thing is going to be in Genesis 1:2. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the spirit of Elohim, God, moved upon the face of the waters. Now, here's one of the reasons why it was a pass, because if in verse 3, Elohim creates light, then in verse 2, there wasn't light. So this thing, this element that was over the face of the water, Hashak, must be at least part of the time the equivalent of blackness, as we perceive pure blackness. Now, it's kind of weird, actually, how we perceive blackness as a pigment, because some blacks as a pigment are not as black as others. I have seen blacks that are far blacker, which really has to be devoid of light. Not only devoid of chroma, but devoid of light. So here in Genesis 1:2, we have Hashak used and called darkness, which, to be honest with you, at least here in this context, I think it would have been far more appropriate to have translated, and blackness was on the face of the waters. Imagine for a moment probably not the scene, because you wouldn't be able to see anything, but a mass of waters, indescribably large in extent, empty, void, with nothing but blackness, darkness, which darkness with absolutely no light at all. Now, I have some phobias concerning the sea, just in the sense that I just don't think the sea is the natural habitat, of course, for man. The land is. And I would just, one thing I think I would really hate, when I read the story of, for instance, Jonah, and them being out at sea, and I certainly don't think they were in the Mediterranean, but out at sea, in a big sea. And he knew the reason that this storm was breaking up the boat. And he told these guys, he said, this is happening because he went against Yahweh. He went and ran in. And this is a really interesting thing to pay attention to, because he is in the land. It's just considered the Eretz, the land. And this was his thinking. Now, this guy is a prophet of Yahweh. He knows him. In fact, he runs from him because he knows that if he sends him to Nineveh, and he preaches repentance to them, that they'll repent and that Yahweh will have mercy on him, and he doesn't want it. So in order to flee from the presence, now this is so interesting. In order to flee from the presence of Yahweh, being a prophet of his, knowing that he is like King David knew, he is ever present. There is no depth that you can hide from him in. There's no deep, dark cave you can go and try to hide from him. So he knew that. But it says that he was fleeing from the face of Yahweh. He did not want to be in his presence, before his face. And so what he did was he picked a place far away, because he did not believe that the presence of Yahweh was in any other land than the land that he came from. It's just interesting that he had that mindset. So he tells them, you're going to have to get rid of me, or else your boat's going down. Probably ship is going down. So you got to toss me into the sea, which is what they did. They tossed him into the sea. And it says that Yahweh had prepared a great fish. And just the thought of being thrown into the sea in that storm, maybe at night. I don't know. I don't know that it says it was night, to be honest. That idea, for me, I don't like. I don't think it's a phobia in the sense that there's, phobias tend to be irrational fears. I just don't like the sea or open water. I don't really even go and swim in it. And this is why. It's just not our natural element. And there are a great amount of wild creatures in there that can cause great harm to us. I just don't see it as smart. If I want to swim, I'll go to a swimming pool. Or at least an inland body of water that's small enough to where it doesn't present the sort of dangers that the great open ocean seas and large inland seas even do. So just a thought. The blackness and water. That's what there was before light. And that's why Hashak qualifies, at least in my word study, as black. Not because it always is black. I don't think it is always black, but because it can be. Now, the mode, the listing that uses it as black, if you look at it in the KJC, H2821, you'll see that most of the time it's actually just dark, darkened. And And I think that's really appropriate because, again, like with the absence of light, which is darkness, there are degrees to it. Now, where things get weird, and this and a few other, of course, words that I'm going to go over, they're going to be words that the Black Hebrew Israelites use to prove that the Israelites was black. And they're not really taking into account the fact that, again, like I just said, light is so often used euphemistically for good. If somebody said somebody's face looked very bright, it would be a positive, because nobody tends to have their face or visage look bright if they're depressed or going through a bad time, or if they're an evil person. That is euphemistically described as dark. And you know it is. So when you get to a point, because it's only one point, we have it used as black, is Lamentations 4:8. It says, their visage is blacker than a coal. They're not known in the streets. Their skin cleaves to their bones. It is withered. It's become like a stick. Now, I did do a pretty fast translation on that. And, okay, for one thing, the word herein that is used and it's translated as coal. I think I actually included it in the word list that I usually put at the end of things in nature that could possibly be, such and such color. It is Shahar. Or actually, no, it's Shahar. It's one of the variations of another family that we're going to get in of words that are sometimes translated as black, which is Shahar. We're going to talk about that too. So what's strange about it is, and it has an M prefix. If it's in a passage of comparison, that M prefix is going to function as than. THAN for comparison rather than from, which it often functions as in regular context. But it's just Hashak ma Shahur. And proving that ma Shahur has to be coal is not as easy as you might think. Unfortunately, there are words that are translated as coal that are probably a little bit more likely to be coal as we think, just the actual material that is taken from the ground and used for fuel, coal. It is quite black. In this case, it doesn't have any other verse references that would tell us it's coal. In fact, in Lamentations 4:8, what we're probably looking at is two words that have something to do with either in color shade or simply in spiritual or emotional metaphor, have to do with darkness. So when the Black Hebrew Israelites try to use this as proving that the Israelites were black, they're using a verse that is using circular reasoning to try to prove something, when in fact it's mostly talking about darkness, because if you read in context this verse with Lamentations 4, you'll see that it was because the Hebrews that lived in Jerusalem at the time were going through hardships and famine. And I really don't care what color you are when you're going through hardship and famine. Your visage is going to become quite dark. Some people call it an aura. Some people claim to be able to see auras, an energy that is emitted around a person. I don't know if they do or not. I'm not making any judgments on that. But what I am is saying that this specifically is talking about somebody's perceivable or imperceivable visage during a time of hardship. Now, this darkening can show itself in a darkening of the face, which oftentimes happens underneath and around the eyes. That will tend to darken the face quite a lot. There really is a darkness that comes over one who is in the midst of hard times, starvation, oppression, which is what's going on in Lamentations 4:8. And that is the only point that you're going to see this word translated as black. So even though it passed, it didn't pass because of any appearances of H2821. If I was going on just the appearances of that, I would say fail, because it would only be referring to various levels of darkness, which most of the time when you see Hashak, Hashake, which is H2825, you'll see that as darkness, or Mshahak. Almost any time you see that M prefixed on a pre-existing action or thing, verb or noun, it's going to be a word that is very similar to it. Mshahak. It's going to be darkness. It's going to be darkness. However, because of Genesis 1:2, we know that Mshahak, in its extreme expression, is blackness. Now, there are words, of course, that I wrote down as being related, and I think they're all valuable. Look at the document. I post these documents at the OBRY project site on the resources pages each time I produce one of these episodes. They're worthwhile. They're going to give you a lot of words that appear to be within the same family. Not all of them necessarily are, but I do try to find which ones have the same biglyph root. Remember, any word, like this is a triglyph, it's going to be made up of a biglyph root. That's going to be the dominant root in it. So I usually try to find where the dominant root is. If I can find Hashak or any of its forms with a singer or vowel in between the ha and sha, or in between the sha and ka, that usually tells me where the dominant root is. That's your clue that you're always looking for the dominant root. You would bring up, and I've explained this before, how to bring these up in eSword so that you're in and get the Hebrew Old Testament Plus that is available in the download section. You go to download Bibles and you'll go to the language Hebrew, and you'll see there's a Hebrew OT and a Hebrew OT Plus. Now, it doesn't follow the KJV exactly. There are a number of times when the verses are off. If something is, say, Deuteronomy, I'm just being arbitrary here, Deuteronomy 5:10. And who knows if it follows or not. In KJV, it might be Deuteronomy 5:9 in that version. This is why I said you should also download HSB, which is the Hebrew Study Bible, 2, HSB 3, and HSB 4. HSB 2 has the Hebrew calligraphic block character, as well as the strong coded number, as well as the brief textual entry that represents it. HSB 3 has just the calligraphic block character and the Strong's number. HSB4 has just the Hebrew calligraphic character with the Masorah applied to it. The earlier one I told you, Hebrew OT and Hebrew OT Plus, does not have the Masorah applied, which is why I use it most often. The only problem is it is the HSB 2, 3, and 4 that completely follow word for word or line for line the KJV. So that's why I suggest you do it. Do that with various Hebrew words that you're trying to do a study on. And what you will do is bring up any word that is a triglyph or greater. If it's a biglyph word, then what you're going to want to do is look for words that it is within. And as I said, one of the best ways to determine what the dominant root is, or if you're looking for a biglyph within words that are 3 glyphs, 4 glyphs, so on. What you're going to do is you're going to look for either U or E, or sometimes it might be other singers or vowels, but usually it's the presence of the U or E, which is the equivalent of our modern day U and I/Y. You're going to look for them betwixt the other glyphs. That's going to signal to you where the dominant root is. The way you're going to be able to do that is to bring these words on the screen, open up your Hebrew Old Testament Plus in eSword, right-click, and then go over and select Old Testament. It will show you all of the occurrences in the Old Testament and in the form they appear in. Because just because something is listed in Strong's as, we'll just take this, Hashak, for example, it doesn't mean that every occurrence of it is going to be as Ha-sha-ka. Some appearances, who knows, could be Ha-i-sha-ka, Heshak, or Hashik. Now, depending on how those appear is going to tip you off to what the dominant root is. The dominant biglyph root should be where that glyph, usually either, like I said, usually either the I or the U, appears between. So if they appeared between, in this case, the Ha and the Sha, then Hash would be my dominant root. If they appeared between the Sha and the Ka, then Shak would be my dominant root. Okay, so moving forward, we have another sort of oddball. There's 2 words, they're both, of course, related, that appear, and at some point or another, of course, they're translated as black. You know what typically tends to happen is you'll punch in black, say to the Blue Letter Bible as a word search. You'll select, you'll usually, so that you don't get a gigantic list, what you're going to do is select the little bubble below the word search box that says beginning of a word or exact match. I picked beginning of the word because black can appear as black, blackened, blackness, blackish. So I chose beginning of the word. And you're going to get your results. So this is, let's see, it comes up twice. What I'm saying is most of the time you get all those results. The word that you're looking for can frequently just end up being a minority within all those results. And that's the case with black. Like we saw with Hashak. I mean, Hashak, between its 3 different listings, it appears probably hundreds of times, but only one time as actually black. So the next one is Kumar, Strong's H3648. So the thing is with a lot of these entries, specifically these entries in the study on black, I could not find a lot of modern words. in any form of what they call Pi Proto-Indo-European that I thought were appropriate possible matches. But the weird thing is, for the next one, it's actually the next two entries because they're related, Kumar and Khmer. I speculated that you could relate certain names to them. And I think that is a really good idea. Whenever you see a name, frequently a name that we would consider Jewish because it comes from people who are self-identified as Jews. Look at those names and consider the similar phonetics. Because names can come from either tribe being a very, very old patriarch, like, for instance, the West Coast lumber magnate, as brought to my attention by Nathan from the Everything Keys show, named Emerson. Now, not only is not every name that has son or man on the end of it is Jewish per se, but many of them are. Now, you see a name like Emerson, and you take that first part of the name, Emer, and realize that phonetically it is very close to Emer. You remember that was one of the Canaanite tribes that made up the land in which the children of Israel inherited. It could come from very old tribal ancestry. It could come from location. So there are people in the Bible that are called by a certain name which actually indicates where they're from. Probably the most prolific example of this you'll find heavily in the New Testament, but you also find in the Old Testament. They're referred to as Samaritans, but more accurately, Shomroni, because they heavily inhabited what was the once capital of the northern kingdom, Shomron. And they just became known as Shomroni. These people from the north specifically gathered in this area, but basically, in a Shomroni was typically a mixed person because they would possibly be made up their lineage from Hamati, from Separuim, Babeli, Parasi. There were so many different tribes of people that, for instance, the king of Ashur brought in. And then later, other kings imported more various people. They could be Orabim, the darker peoples, plain peoples that dwelt all around because they moved in larger numbers when probably after many of the northern kingdom Israelites were carted off. But also when the Yudim, Benjamin, and Luim were all taken to Babel. So it's just an example of a place being translated to a name or something descriptive, like in the example of Orabim, descriptive. And then the last one would be, at some point, a notable patriarch would come into this world, and they would be notable for either, probably some deeds or large family or something, and people would inherit a name from them. A good example of that is Galod. If you see in the Bible a Gileadite, really interesting story. It comes from, it's supposed to be more accurately, Galodi. Galod being the place that Jacob names in Genesis 31, I believe, with his meeting with Laban. However, when the children of Yisrael come back from Mitzrayim. Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, half of the tribe of Manasseh, they decide to inherit on the other side of Yarden. I'm guarding myself from saying east of Yarden. And there's a good reason for that. I've been finding out some strange anomalies within the language as I'm working through it on the book. And perhaps I'll know more. I don't plan on doing an exhaustive study of east, west, north, south for the book. But anyways, they're on the other side. It's typically written as Ba'ober Yarden, or sometimes La'ober Mayard, or Ma'ober Layarden. They're on the other side of Yarden. So there's this big area on the other side of Yarden. It's called Galod because of Genesis 31. However, Manasseh had a grandson that came with them from Mitzrayim, and he militarily took over a large portion of that land. Galod, half of it, he and his tribe, his sub-tribe, took over. So, people from the region of Galod would be known probably as Galodi, as well as those from that prominent family, Galodi. Now, it's really interesting because if they're from that prominent sub-tribe, Galod, and they're from that region, Galod, it's hard to pinpoint if they're called Galodi because they're from that grandson of Manasseh or because they're specifically from that region. This is one of the safeguards, or let's say litmuses, that Yahweh built into the scriptures so that those people who would not study closely and diligently could be fooled by those who are very talented sophists. Anyways, so that would be another way in which somebody might get a name or retain a name, retain family title. This happens in many other parts of the world too, by the way. A lot of Italians with the name De, it's because they're from a place with that name. So when you look at Kumar and you see that you have people who are self-identified Jews, like James Cameron, or maybe even Kurt Cameron. You know Kurt Cameron. He's that actor from that old show Growing Pains who said that he had a conversion to Christianity and has subsequently starred early on in one of the most deceptive movies made on a book about eschatology called Left Behind. And he's a huge supporter of John MacArthur, somebody I would not support, nor in a small way, nor a big way, really. Cameron is quite possibly derived from that word. Maybe. They list it in the online etymology dictionary as actually a Highland clan name from the Gaelic Camsharan, which, of course, would require it had a Shah in it, and it doesn't. What's really interesting, though, about the Gaelic name Camshran is that they say that it means wry or hooked nose. And the funny thing is, concerning the history of Scotland, a number of the boroughs, and you know that many self-identified Jews have, at least within their last name, Berg, very similar to borough, or boroughs. And I would imagine that what's his name, that greasy beat poet from way back when, who was in Drugstore Cowboy, Burroughs. He's probably a self-identified Jew. Or crypto. There were many crawling around Scotland. Now, this is one of the reasons why I said in episode 1 of the Everything Keys that I think that just Jew as a classification is an oversimplification, because there were many tribes of different kinds of people that came from the old world. Not just Israelites, not just tribes of Israelites. There were the various tribes of Canoni, and I'll just use the anglicized names: Edomites, Moabites, Ammonites, Amalekites, Hamati, Arami, and so on. So anyways, the word itself, Kamer. Kamer, again, only appears one time in the text. It's H3648. One time is black. It appears 4 times altogether. And the one time in which it appears as black is again in Lamentations 5:10. We'll see this as a pattern in certain books, that it would appear that those crafting the language as we know it today wanted us to perceive things in a certain way. Now, the other times when Kamer is used, it's used as kindled, yearned, or yearning. Now, you know, a yearning, especially a heavy yearning, is something that is hot, usually. Something that makes you feel sort of a inner heat. Or an emptiness, depending. Now, in Lamentations 5:10, the English translates, "Our skin was black like an oven because of the terrible famine." The comparative word used is tenur. I checked tenur, and it does check out as possibly an oven or kiln or vessel to cook or heat in, it would seem. It itself does not have a lot of occurrences. However, again, in context, if you look at this sensibly, in context, it would appear that what he's saying is that the skin was basically dry, hot upon them. You look at, now, this is actually appropriate. I'll read this passage because it's certainly, with everything that's going on today, and I'm specifically also including all of that stuff that's going down now in the state of Virginia, with the way that Jew Michael Bloomberg, as well as I've heard rumors that the Dark Emperor was involved in that as well. Soros, that's right. Buying up blue seats to pass certain legislation in Virginia. And I could talk about that at length because I don't think there's any accident. People are talking about like how stupid the Democrats are for doing something like that in the state of Virginia. And I don't think that it's stupidity. I think that was very well planned to happen there. They're trying to drastically destabilize the United States. And if we don't repent and get things right, you know, we've let so much immorality go on around us for so long, but we're going to take a stand on the Second Amendment. We let our neighbors be oppressed because they are speaking their mind or trying to tell us the truth about things that we don't feel like hearing. But we're going to take a stand on the Second Amendment. You see, there's a certain degree of double-mindedness to that. And I really do want things to go well for our people, but I don't know what the costs are going to be. He says in Lamentations 5:1-10, "Remember, O Yahweh, what has come upon us. Consider and behold our reproach. Our inheritance is turned to strangers, our houses to aliens. We are orphans and fatherless, our mothers as widows. We have drunken our water for money. Anybody buy water out there? Our wood is sold unto us. That's right, we don't own anything. We can't just go out and take a tree out and use it for our fuel. He says, our necks are under persecution. We labor and have no rest. We've given the hand to the Mitzri and the Asheri or Asher to be satisfied with bread. Our fathers have sinned and are not, and we have borne their iniquities. Does that sound familiar? Servants have ruled over us. There's none that delivers us out of their hand. We gat our bread with the peril of our lives because of the sword of the wilderness. Our skin was black like an oven because of the terrible famine. Now, in context, does anybody think that that is black, as in the pigment? Kumar. It appears here once as black, and then we're going to see Kumar one more time in a slightly different form as Kamarir. It actually only has one appearance in total, and that one appearance is in Job 3:5. Job, again, any one of these books that involves a great amount of waxing poetic, euphemism or symbolism, I would say it needs to be approached with a pretty great amount of caution. Now, Kamarir is H3650, and in Job 3:5, it says, let darkness and the shadow of death stain it. Let a cloud dwell upon it. Let the blackness of the day. The blackness of the day terrify. The blackness of the day. Terrify it. Here's the thing. If you go back to the root of this, Kumar, and you'll see that out of the 4 times it occurs, 3 of those 4 times have to do with heat. Now, the root could be mar actually being bitter. The associated words that I found with it, one is actually the exact same word, Kumar, and it's used to refer to, they translate it as an idolatrous priest, but they're mentioned sometimes in context with the kenim, ken being the word for the priest, the high priest in the line of Aaron. They were Lewim or Levites. They were called ken, K-E-N, ken. It's probably the root where we get the name Kenneth from. So there was a class of people. I don't know that this came from a patriarch or being more descriptive. Kumar. They're mentioned a few times. There's Mukamar and Mukamarut is translated as nets. And what I did was I found what ought to be the dominant root in the mur portion. Mur itself is used and translated often what appears to be correctly as bitterness. And then there's kameh, which is to long for or to desire. It's kind of a strange toss-up between those two. I had deemed Mar as the probable dominant biglyph, but I did include Kam in just the occurrence where it appears as Kameh. I don't have an actual Kam word. In all, it does appear to be more appropriately used as kindle, yearn. And then when you see its context in Job 3:5, let the blackness of the day terrify it. And that is Yom, the day. Or would the more appropriate rendering of that be the hotness, dryness, desolation, something about the negative aspect of the day, which is typically articulated as the heat of the day. Anybody who's worked outside long enough knows that it's usually the heat of the day. That is the part of the day that one could describe as being negative. So we move from there into one that I'm not even going to put a lot of time into, even though I showed plenty of words that could be possibly seen as related words. I'm not even going to spend much time on it. A couple reasons. First off, it has one occurrence, and that one occurrence is in the infamous Esther 1:6. We've already seen words in the other word studies up to this point that are either in Esther 1:6 or in that first chapter, and they are all screwy. Now, anybody who's listened to me for long enough knows that I don't even affirm Esther as a canonical book, one that I think has enough veracity to it to be considered a canonical book. I think Esther reads like, sounds like, has the kind of language of and immoral core to be considered a rabbinic work, not a biblical work, not keeping in the same vein as biblical books. The word that's translated as blackness is Strong's H5508. It's Saharat. Now, one of the reasons, besides the fact that it only occurs once in an Esther 1:6, that I think it's bunk, and I'm not going to put the kind of time in, is because so often you will see the Masoretes, and it has to make you wonder if they even really understood the language. They are going to apply the meaning of words that have a sh in them to words that have a s in them. Those are two completely different glyphs. Therefore, the meanings that they carry along with them are completely different. And what they're doing is they're applying the same sort of term, the same sort of definition to Saharat as we would see in the Shahar family, which we're going to get to here in just a few minutes. Now, the next listing is parur, which, looking right at it, I would not think it had anything to do with black. It appears 2 times. It is Strong's H6289. Parur. Now, the 2 places that it appears, both in the prophets, both in passages that could be considered definitely waxing poetic or symbolic. I'm going to punch this in real quick so that I can show you the 2 passages in context. H6289 into Isoon KJC. Now, in Joel 2:6, it reads, "Before their face the people shall be much pained, all faces shall gather blackness." Shall gather blackness. And in Nahum 2:10, "She is empty and void and waste, and the heart melteth, and the knees smite together, and much pain is in all loins. The faces of them all gather blackness." Again, gather blackness. Now, I did look at these both in OBRY, and in this case, I will actually read my summation. It failed Oh, and by the way, I'm sorry, some of the related words, I couldn't find many modern words that I really thought were comparable to this. I did put down pair, P-A-R-E, but you'll kind of see where I'm going with this. Some of the related words are H6286 par, to glorify, beautify, or adorn, par, having to do with beautifying or adorning. Also 6287 par, which is translated as a headdress or ornament, again, to beautify, ornament. 6288 pare is translated a bough, branch, or shoot. And then you have 8597 to pare, beauty, splendor, glory. Now, this is made up, in my opinion, of two roots. The second being H7388 rear, which we actually went over in the document on the color white. Rear has more to do with liquid. Liquid wetness. That was one thing we found out in that study. And the word H6284, pa'e, corner. And also 6285 is the same, pa'e, corner, edge. So it failed due to the evidence of related words besides the obvious par words. There's the combination of pa'e, which was the one I just read, 6284 and 85, being edge or corner, and rear, also related to ruhr or just rar, which is just air. It's a biglyph pertaining to liquid. Whatever the actual meaning is in the context of its two appearances, gathering sweat, as in at the temples or edges of the face, which is what someone does when they're in distress, is far more appropriate. So you can see it again in those two passages, Joel 2:6, all faces shall gather, and instead of blackness, you would think parir as an adornment, liquid, like sweat at the temples. Same with Nahum 2:10. She is empty and void and waste, and the heart melteth, and the knees smite together, and much pain in all loins. Sounds like someone in distress, right? And the faces of them shall all, what? Gather blackness, or gather liquid around the face or the temples. That is what someone does. They gather moisture around the edges of their face when they are in distress. They're sweating at the temples, at the brow, the cheeks. That's what's far more likely. So that one was a real stretch. I mean, beyond reasonable stretch. Now we have basically two more to go. The first one is Kadar. It is H6937. It appears a number of times, and it does appear in a few different listings. Now, one thing you'll find if you do a little looking around is, first off, Kadar is the name of one of Ishmael's sons. It's Kadar. Now, it is the 6937 entry of it, and this appears in two different forms, both Kadar and Kadarut. Kadarut 1 time, Kadar 4 times as black. The other times you're going to see it is dark 4 times, morning 4 times, morn 2 times, blackish once, and darkened once. Now, the times that it appears as black or blackish is going to be, for instance, 1 Kings 18:45, and it came to pass in the meanwhile that the heaven was black with clouds and wind. I've never seen the sky, the heaven, black with clouds and wind. I've seen it dark. darkened by clouds. Also Jeremiah 4:28, for this shall the earth mourn, and the heavens above be black, or darkened. Jeremiah 8:21, for the hurt of the daughter of my people am I hurt. I am black, darkened. And Jeremiah 14:2, Judah mourns, the gates thereof languish, they are black unto the ground. Black unto the ground. Or darkened. Job 6:15 through 16, my brethren have dealt deceitfully as a brook, and as a stream of brooks they pass away, which are blackish by reason of the ice wherein the snow is hid. Does that seem to make any sense at all? Now, we'll look at the other form of it real quick, which, as I said, is Kadarun. Kadarut is what's translated as blackness. It appears once in Isaiah 50, verse 3, I clothe the heavens with blackness and make sackcloth their covering. Now, in this one case of Kadarut, I would say that it's passable. But Kadar, I would not say that in general it's passable, because, first off, most of those passages that it appears in, the description would seem to more dictate darkness, not blackness. So there's a difference, remember, between darkness and blackness. But when you have that te, now coming from a Masoret tradition, they'll tell you that the te, that suffix that's ut, is a feminine plural, which I don't know if is entirely fair. However, it is certainly augmentative in a way. I mean, we can see it in words like Quran with a Q, Quran, is a word for horn, where kornut is the word for a type of horn, an instrument. Like Quran would be the horn, what would be referred to as the horn of an animal, a smaller horn, than kornut, which would be a large horn used as an instrument. So that's why I say it's augmentative as opposed to a feminine plural. Im is also augmentative in a different way. But do you see what I'm getting at with when I talked about the certain, even with Hashak, that there were only times when Hashak should be considered as black, like as in pure black. But there would be many times when you would see Hashak that you would simply look at it as darkness, because there can be darkness and shades of darkness, and then pure black. In the case of Kadar and Kadarut, I believe, is the expression of Kadar to its nth degree, thus being, well, equivalent of black or blackness. The last family of words in this is Shahar, H7835. This is significant for more reasons than just the idea of darkness and all of that. Okay. The 7835 listing appears only once, and I'm going to type that into my eSword so I can get that up. Again, it's in Job. My skin is black upon me and my bones are burned with heat. Now, again, this is seriously one of those verses that I've heard the black Hebrew Israelites use to try to prove that Israelites were black. My skin is black upon me. Well, first off, we're going to see from the other occurrences of Shahar that black it's a bad word. It's just an incorrect word to use here. And my bones are burned with heat. Do you believe his bones were literally burned? Or is he being poetic and symbolic? The other times it's used is as, 7838 Shahar, 6 times as black. And then we have a variation of that, which is Shahar, 1 time as black. The root, of course, being most likely har, which is interesting. Why? Because we went through har and her words in our study of white. And those words that had their root in har or her were more likely either having to do with hot as in friction. The English words that were or the modern words, because sometimes they're French, German, whatever. Things like harried, hurry, hurt, harm. These all have a lot to do with friction, heat, tension words. So that Shahar is doubling up on that har biglyph. And we'll get to that. All right, the first one that I just read you from Job is definitely in a poetic passage and should probably not be taken as black under any circumstances. And again, one thing I want to actually bring up, because of Kadar, you're going to see that actually used in a number of poetic passages. Kadar, maybe even more than Shahar, and I think that they're actually not all that different, the two. Kadar, more often, I believe, in a euphemistic manner, should be seen as something that is more a grimness or dimness of the soul. And here's the thing. We can actually see all of them related to that sort of mental or spiritual condition. The thing is, the three that qualify more than any, being Hashak, Kadar, and Shahar, they all have a certain aspect to them which could be looked at as emotional, mental, spiritual. However, since they're all made of distinctly different glyphs, I think this is a good illustration of how English just does not do the job at relaying to us the nuances of these different words that all have at least a connotation of something dark to them. So where we're going to see Shahar used the most as black is in its 7838 appearances or entry. Literally, I believe every time this is used, it is translated as black out of the 6 times it's used. The thing about it, and this and Kadar, I had to think pretty long about both of them to decide whether or not the times in which they're used should be purely perceived as black. As I said, Kadarut, definitely, because it is the greatest degree of that word. The thing is, all right, the appearances of Shahar in 7838, the first 2 are used in Leviticus, and it's having to do with some type of the disease that affects the skin. We actually saw these passages in the study on both white and red, because both words having to do with white or lightness or paleness are used in these passages in Leviticus talking about skin diseases, as well as words having to do with red. Now, in these 2 passages, it's Leviticus 13:31, if the priest look on the plague and the skull, and behold, it be not in sight deeper than the skin, and that there is no black hair in it, then the priest shall shut up him that hath the plague of the skull 7 days. And the other is 13:37, so 6 verses later. If the skull be in his sight as a stay, and there is black hair grown up therein, the skull is healed. He is clean, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. Now, here's the funny thing about pigments. Most hair that is seen as black is very dark. There are animals that are seen as black whose hair is very dark brown. It is not black. So that's really the reason that Hashak could pass as having an equivalence with black. It's the reason that Kadar could pass as having an equivalence with black. Because when you take away all of the light, for instance, from the sky, that is a black sky. And if you go to the extreme of darkness, all the way to the furthest end of the spectrum concerning darkness that you get black. But with Shahar, and since it is referring to hair, the third time it's actually referring to skin, and it has to do with being in the sun. It's from Song of Solomon, which after Esther, I have a great deal of question whether it belongs in the canon or not, but it's fine. We'll still look at it. Okay, so starting in 1:5, this is the female speaking. And the first black you see is the Shahar, okay? She says, I'm black but comely, O ye daughters of Jerusalem, as the tents of, and we see this word, right? Kadar, as the curtains of Solomon. Look not upon me because I'm black. There we go again. Because the sun has looked upon me, my mother's children were angry with me. They made me keeper of the vineyards. She's not black. You know what? Even if this was talking about black folks, and it's not, she still wouldn't be black. We're talking about the color black. Now, that's what surprises me. Anyways, forget about the black Hebrew Israelites. Anyways, what she's saying is she's darkened from the sun. The whitest white folks get very dark in the sun. This is it. Okay, so you have those two passages concerning the hair, and it's called black. There's no hair that's black. None. It's dark brown. It's very dark brown. So that's what it is. It's very dark. Now there's the passage in Song of Songs 5:11 that it's supposed to say, his head is as the most fine gold, his locks are bushy and black as a raven. That is one of the worst translated passages I've ever come across. There are at least 3 words within that passage that are descriptive words concerning him that you can't prove anywhere else. They have no other equivalents in the Bible. So it's a terrible passage to point to prove anything. You also have Zechariah 6:2 and 6:6, where he is describing a team of horses. And this word is used, Shahar, which is translated as black. Again, we saw those passages in the study for white and red, because he sees a team of horses that are white, described as Laban. He sees a team of horses that are red, described as Adamni. Now, again, they're not going to be red like we're going to perceive red. Part of it has to do with types of hair pigments blended together and seen in a certain light that would give a horse or team of horses an appearance that would be red. Either that, or because it's in a vision, he's seeing them as more red than commonly you would see horses. But there are horses that are described as red because of the mixture of their lighter brown hairs that have a certain amount of reddish pigment to them. You're never going to see a horse that has the same amount of reddish pigment as, say, a white redhead. You might see a fox that does. But then he sees a team of what is called Shahar horses, and they just decide arbitrarily to translate as black. However, there is no horse out there. I've seen dark horses. They're dark looking. Again, there is no hair pigments in nature that are pure black, as we would consider pure black, because they have hue to them. This is the point. They have hue to them. They're just extremely dark. They are like hue with a dark shade. That's why you can have extremely dark browns in hair that look black, especially in certain lighting, low lighting. In high lighting, sometimes they may look blue depending on their sheen. Or you have the lighter end of brown, a lighter hue that obviously will sometimes just look brown, but sometimes look reddish depending on whether or not they have the red hue to them. And that's all the occurrences of Shahar as black. The last one is Shahar 7840. I'm going to move to that real quick on the fly here. And again, it's in Song of Songs. It was the verse I just read. Look not upon me because I am Shahar. You remember what I said about har and how it had a lot to do with friction or heat. Heat. Darkened by heat. So even though some occurrences of Shahar might again merit a degree further towards black in the spectrum than others, I still couldn't consider it an equivalent of black, as we would consider black today. What's kind of interesting, though, about Shahar being used as, forget about black, but dark. It is definitely, and you don't really have to argue much with it, very clearly used in a proper contextual way as dark. The funny thing is, it's actually also 7837. It's used as morning, which is interesting. I would think morning just before the sun came up. Early. It's actually used as early in a number of passages. That's not the most interesting thing. The most interesting thing is that one of its variations, which is not listed right next to it because its variation actually has the glyph I right after the first glyph Sha, and it is H7883, Shihur. What makes this significant is that, for one, it appears in 1 Chronicles 13:5. So David gathered all Israel together from Shihur of Mitzrim, even unto the entering of Hamat, to bring the ark of Elohim from Kirjath Jearim. Shihur is then used interchangeably with the Ner or river of Mitzrim. The reason this is significant is because it was a dark river. And not all rivers are dark rivers. Some are. Some have more of a dark hue or tone. Of course, a lot of rivers pick up the tone of whatever minerals that the rock that makes up the bed or sides flow through. There can be rivers that are more orange, have more of a red hue, have more of a dirty, kind of a foul, dirty look. Some can even be yellowish. But the fact that this was a dark river. And the other thing that's interesting, because this is something that helps when you're looking into the geography and topography of what was actually the Holy Land. So you have this one river of Mitzrayim that was described as Shihur, which is likely dark, even though it appears once actually as Shihur, so it has an extra ich between the Shah and Ha, and it has an extra between the Ha and Er. But it also appears without the extra ich and just in that extra glyph, and then it appears once without either. So I would say it's a safe bet that it still means dark. The other thing interesting is there is a river that runs to one side of Jerusalem, and I believe it's the Kadem side, so I'm going to say for now the east. Its name is actually Kadar. It has that Ka, De, Er, just like we went over, Kadar. That's its root. Remember, the UN suffix is very much like our OUS suffix today, Kadar. So that river probably was a bit of a darker river too. There's a lot of reasons why a river can be dark, and it doesn't necessarily have to do with a dirtiness. As I said, there can be all different sorts of reasons why a river's dark instead of light. Like, for instance, in Mitzrayim, they have a body of water that's called the ER. In a few different instances that it's actually called Iaur. So the root is A-U-R, which that word, Aur, is the word for light. Having the ich at the beginning of it could very much mean that they called it the light bringer. Does that mean that the river was very light? As in no microbes that were coloring it, or minerals or silt or anything else that tends to color the waters of a river. Perhaps it was so clear and pristine that you could easily see through it, and it sort of sparkled or reflected the light. Perhaps that's why they named it that too. People tended to name things, bodies of water, landmarks, and even cities, places, by their dominant characteristics. That's why these things are important. That's one of the reasons why knowing what these words are and what they mean are so important. And that's one of the very dominant reasons that I'm studying this language without the burden of the Masorah, to get to the exact meaning and use of these glyphs. There's a whole world in the Bible that we haven't tapped into for a very, very long time. And I think in these later days that it's about time that we do. So I'm not going to go on too much else about anything else now that I've concluded that word study. Look for the document at the OBRY Project on the resources page. And until the next one, I hope everybody again is very well, and please pray for the people of Virginia and our people worldwide, that we come to our senses as soon as possible, and that this world would be put right once and for all. Take care.